So I wanted to do a little more detailed study of color mixing and color layering if you're working primarily with Tombows or the water-based markers. I don't have a grayscale set like you have. What I have is the skin tone set. But first things I'm going to show you is how to mix on a palette. So you can mix on anything, a glass, a piece of metal, the lid of a plastic lid of a Tupperware or something. I'm using this little tray. But if you put down ink with a dark color and then use a lighter color to pick it up, you can ombre essentially from the dark color to the lighter color. You can also use it with the mixing color or mixing between two colors. So this is a dark brown, and then I'm rolling the brush tip of the light brown through it, picking it up, and then going back and forth, and slowly it will switch back to the color of the marker that I have. So it just sort of like runs out of the ink that you picked up. So that can be really useful if you're looking at wanting to create pretty quick, very smooth blendings in a small area with the Tombows. I know some of you are finding the blending can be a little bit splotchier or streakier than you like. So with this one, we're going to mix from a brown to a pink. You can do it between colors, but I'd always recommend jumping in with the dark color, laying that down, picking it up on the lighter color, and then kind of going back over the darker color areas with the lighter color so that they blend once again. It won't work if you try to put down a light color ink. It's not going to mix into a darker color. So it's always going to have to be put the dark color on your plate or on your palette and then pick it up with a lighter color. You're going to get less streaking if you use the sides of your pens, and using the sides to pick up the pigment also works better because you can lay it down in bigger swaths of color versus trying to do it with just the point. You can also use your paintbrush and a little bit of water to try to smear things or to soak an area, but it's more likely to destroy your paper. Versus the blending marker has a very nice amount of like carefully saturated water. It's not going to do the same destruction to your top layer of paper. You can even practice with laying down water and then drawing on top of that for softer line work areas. You can get nice soft pastel smears with that, but you do have to be a little careful about the paper you're working on. So this is my clear blending marker. You can see that yes, it does reactivate, and I can work out, like even if I do an ombre, I can then go back and clean up that edge to make it go all the way to 0. But I like to use the clear marker also to do a color pickup, and then you can go from one color all the way out to the color of the paper to clear. So I've got a little hand sketched here. Since I only have skin tones, we're doing skin tones. But just so you can see how I can layer these colors, which are pretty predetermined. I don't have a lot of variations in them, or a lot of different percentages. This is my research image sort of out on the side. So first thing I'm going to do, I like to lay in my dark tones, or kind of a medium version of my dark tones. I don't have that kind of very deep purpley color that's in there, but we're going to build up to it. So I'm going to start by just building in a warm shadow with the darkest pink that I have. I'm using the brush tips, not the bullet tips, and I'm using directional strokes to kind of build it. I know it's streaky right now, but I'm going to end up going over it so many times that you're probably not going to be able to see those when I'm done, right? For my palette, I use this little saucer from a tea set, so you can't always see the colors on it, but I'll try to swatch as I go with it. So I've mixed together a pink and this brown to try to build in a deeper shadow by putting down the pink tone, picking it up on the brown, and now going over it and layering it over the pink that I already laid in. And then creating a mid-tone area with this kind of caramel brown that's warm but a step lighter than the deep brown that I put in, and bouncing around and picking up all those little extra shadows that aren't as dark as that main shadow. With markers, it's always going to look super streaky and kind of patchy about halfway through, and you just have to have faith that when they get finished layering, they will all come together. So right now, this looks kind of crazy because those shadows seem really stark or kind of all over the place. I haven't swatched my Tombows, which is why you'll see me keep testing them on the side quite as often. I haven't swatched and wrapped each marker, so I'm checking against the caps. So I'm using this very bright but very pale pink to start creating kind of a fade out from the shadow areas, and also to unify and block in my lighter midtones and bounce lights on the bottoms of the fingers. Going back in with that darker pink and unifying that deep shadow, bumping my contrast all along this back side of the hand. I'm also letting some of the strokes help me with the texture of the skin, where the wrinkles are, things like that. So if you know it's going to be streaky because markers just sort of lean that way, you can try to use the streaks to your advantage instead of fighting them the whole time. So I'm going to take my clear marker and just do a little bit of smearing, getting those layers mixed together, getting those shadows a little softened. You can see that we're definitely starting to get more of a three-dimensional shaping to this, but right now it looks kind of stark where the shadows wrap around the fingers. They're a little intense. Need some more midtones. So I'm going in with this kind of pale yellowy peach and creating a lot of midtones with that. So that the only places that are being left bright white are where we have our brightest highlights. And even just that pass, that one flat pass with that kind of mid-tone color helped a lot. So now we're going to start doing a little bit more of that palette mixing. So everything before this was more traditional, just laying in layers, trying to get them mixed with gradients. But now I'm using my clear blender a lot on this layer to start building some softer gradients in these tight little areas. So I'm picking up this dark brown on my clear blender. When you are trying to cover areas flat with the clear blender method that you're creating like gradients, it can be kind of hard. That's what my gradient I've got is, so it's not that dark. You can also see it runs out of pigment pretty quickly, so you'll need to keep putting down more of the pigment that you're picking up in order for you to always have the same amount, sort of. So still using my clear blender, and I'm using a pretty fine brush point, but I'm going through and placing this kind of middle of the ground version of the darkest shadow and using it to smooth out any streakiness inside this flat shadowed area, and also to pull out from the shadow to make it have softer edges, to hide any brush strokes. I'm working on a pretty heavy cardstock that has a nice waxy finish on it, but you'll see I still get a little bit of pilling and things on it. But I don't worry about it too much. The paper's not buckling too much, and I can always brush all of that off at the end. So now I'm trying to make sure that I want to switch colors, so I'm clearing off my clear blender so that I can carry into the pinks and start warming this up a little bit. So this is my dark pink, and I'm picking it up on the clear blender and using it to create warmth and radiance from where it kind of bounces out of the dark brown, trying to warm up that dark brown. The dark tone that I have is a little green cast, which I love a green cast in a shadow and skin, but it's a little heavy here. So we're adding some of this pink and magenta tones to warm it up, to show blood pooling. You can see I'm picking up what I've put down pretty fast. So even though I've tried to cover, a couple inches there in that pink color, I do use it up pretty fast. So this is a little bit of a yellowish, pale yellow color that I'm using to define where light is touching just the tips of fingers and bouncing, giving a little bit of a contrasting midtone to define lighting source. Adding it in all over, letting that yellow sort of mix with the layers underneath helps to also hide any streakiness and blend everything together. This is sort of a taupey color, so it has a nice cool tone to it. You know I love a cool shadow. So trying to use that taupe to help bump that shadow with a final pass and also cool it down to contrast the yellow that we just added. It also mixes really nicely with that pink because it's a cooler tone, so using it to help bridge some of the gap between those two shadows. This one's like a warm peach, so once again warming up the midtones, warming up where it exits the shadow and coming into the light. This is the darkest color I have that isn't black on this kit, so doing a final contrast bump at the very back here. It has a lot of green in it though, so I don't want to go in too heavy with it. The paper gets more porous as you go, more prone to absorption because you're taking off the top layer. So I'm going in with the clear blender and a little bit of that darkest brown on the tip of it and blending it out. I'm using this dark color to sort of adjust where the shadow was. I realized I wanted it bumped over a little bit. Since it's dark, it can kind of hide everything underneath it, so using it to move over a bit. Smooth it out by using that medium kind of caramel brown over the top to help be my blender in those brown dark layers. And one more touch with, trying to find it, the medium kind of brighter peach to help blend it. Now you know I like a white gel pen as one of my final steps in my markering, so I don't have to preserve as many whites. I'm using it to put the highlights on the thumbnail, the very tips of the fingers where those nails would have caught the light. Help define this white highlight from the index finger. And then I like to add a little bit of contrast with my background here. With a black Tombow, I'm able to kind of make a watercolor-like effect. So I'm just laying down straight black right now. And then this is the blender marker. You can see it pulls it out a little bit, but there's still a pretty stark difference between where the blender's pulling it out and where I laid it in. So we're gonna do the palette method where I lay black on the palette, pick it up on my blending marker, and then use that to pull out and soften these edges a little bit. And you can get much more of a watercolor effect by using your blender marker. So I'm wanting it to get lighter as it goes up, so I didn't lay any pure black down up here. I'm kind of creating a soft gradient in the background. So from here on up, I'm going to do it with just the blending marker and how much of the black I'm picking up and how much of it I'm, using in one spot before I start pulling out from it. So darkening the background here is allowing me to see those highlights as they bounce off the top of the fingers. And the blending marker works really well to create these softer gradients, these pullouts. It just takes a little bit of trial and error, a little bit of practice, but you can get some very nice effects by using it. Adding a little bit of line work back in with a pencil. You can always use a colored pencil on top of your markers also, so if you don't have a white gel pen or you don't have, you can put in your shadows a little deeper with a pencil on top. It works really well. And they both like the same type of paper, so as you work through these next projects, it's totally acceptable to use a colored pencil to help bump a couple things. So here's as far as I got with the Tombows with the colors that I have. You can see sort of a close-up on how the gradients look over on the side, and then how much of the streakiness we were able to cover, even though it was really streaky when we started. So I'm going to show you how to layer alcohol markers on top of your Tombows. So these are all the colors I have in Tombow. As you know from my demos, I love a purple shadow, a blue shadow. So I don't have that color in Tombows, so I'm going to try to put in some shadows over this with alcohol markers. I'm once again going to use the blending palette. It works very, very similarly, but you do not want to mix the inks at all on that palette, or using, alcohol markers picked up on a Tombow blender is not going to go well for you. So I'm laying alcohol marker ink down in a section, being careful not to mix it with the others, and now I'm going to get out my blender. I have a Prismacolor one here with a brush tip. I'm mixing a custom color out of the two purples and that sort of pinkish mauvey color, and using that to layer over some of my shadows and bump them up. Because it's a brush tip that moves a little different than the Tombows, it is more prone to a little bit of streaking on its own because the color doesn't just always move towards the tip. Sometimes it gets stuck higher up and then you don't realize there's still a pretty solid gradient happening. So you have to be a little careful with it, especially since the pores of this paper are open. They're going to take the ink and make it a little darker when it first hits, but you can, once your Tombows are entirely dry, layer alcohol markers on top of it if you have a color in that you want to be using. So I've created kind of a custom color here, and as it's layering over the greens and browns that we use to build the shadow, it's creating a really nice depth and deep, rich color. And then I'm bouncing out and carrying that in just a few other spots. As it starts to wear out and be more and more transparent, I'm using those little sections to help carry the warmth of that purple, but like in a lighter tone, into fingertips and other shadowed areas. So now I'm going over and getting just the more reddish orange color, not as much of the purple, and using that to blend out the really pink shadows, so it's like a hotter, oranger tone. And helps create a transition from the purple layered over the brown into those more peach tones. So you can see that you definitely can mix Tombows and alcohol markers. They just have to be entirely dry. The nice thing is that they're not going to reactivate or anything underneath because you're not using the same material, so they're not going to get more muddy or anything. They're just going to sort of layer on top of each other and optically mix. I would say it is harder to layer alcohol over Tombow only because the Tombow has such an effect on the paper versus layering Tombow on top of alcohol like we'll do in the next demo working with alcohol markers. Just is a little bit easier because you don't have any texture to fight, but it definitely works and can create some really beautiful effects. So here I'm using like a pretty orange, peachy, heavy-handed chisel tip to define this shadow even more strongly. And we'll call it done. So that's the beginning of mixing Tombows a little bit more intensely. You can see you can get some great effects, and layering it with alcohol is also really helpful.